All right. So far, we've discussed connections for between two different objects via constraints. In a lot of animation software and 3D software, 2D software, any digital software where we can manipulate things digitally, we can connect things in other manners. And particularly in Maya, what we can do is set what's called driven keys. And this allows us to dictate between one object to say, hey, when you're at this value, this other object is at this separate value. Because the constraints that we talked about previously directly manipulated the translates towards translates if we were doing a point constraint, rotates to rotates if we were doing orient, translates to rotates if we're doing an aim, right? And then a parent is both translates and rotates. That it would inherit, the child would then inherit whatever the parent was set to, right? So particularly with set different keys, we don't have to be as direct. Like it doesn't have to be translate to translate, it doesn't have to be translate to rotate or whatever, what have you, like the constraints. We can kind of build that customization between them however we so choose. And the first step of doing that is understanding how to use set different keys. And let's discuss that. So I'm gonna go up here to key, and this is in my animation toolkit. Key, and then if we pop down to set driven key, we can click set. When we click this, it doesn't actually set any keys or set any connections. It just pulls open the menu, which looks like this. And let's zoom in and just discuss it before I'll zoom back out. We have a driver and a driven. Essentially, whatever I load into the driver, we have two columns. The left column will be all the objects that are driving. The right column will be all the attributes of those driver objects. So like translates, rotates, etc. Excuse me. Driven will be any object that we want to manipulate based on what we load in the driver. So what does this look like? Let's start over here with the scale of this first object. So we have a note here saying I need this to scale. Let's take a look at what is this. If I select it and I start moving things around, I can see we're just locked on a specific axis. And that's a control here that has a minimum maximum value we'll get into of how to create. But in the moment, I just like, okay, cool. I can move a lever, I can move a switch, I can push it up and down, which means that I need to connect this to scale. This is going to control the scale of this circle, the sphere. So let's go ahead and load this in as the driver because the attributes of this control will drive what we load into the driven. I can select the control and just say load driver in this window. We'll talk more about what we have to select here, but just as a reminder, left column is the object, right column is the attributes of said object. I now need to load my driven. If I select my sphere and say load driven, same thing. Left column, object, right column, attributes. Now we can start setting keyframes. And instead of adjusting and changing our time sliders or adjust forward in time to change to a particular frame, what we're going to do is set keys on a particular attribute rather than time. So essentially we're saying, hey, when the attributes of this are a certain value, the attributes of this are of their own certain value. So what does that look like? I'm going to select that group. I'll go back into my driver. I'll select the group on the left and then go to not rotate or scale, but translate. Because if we take a look, that's what I'm manipulating when I move this object up and down. Everything else is locked on this object. Then I'll set that back. I'll make sure that translate Y is set back to 0. That's very important that it needs to be back at bottom. Then in my driven, I don't have to just hit scale Y. I don't have to build a connection to just one attribute. I can build a connection to multiple. The way you can do that is you just click and drag, or you hold shift or control to add multiple pieces to it. Kind of up to you on how you want to add or deselect things. You can hold control and click them off as well. But right now I have translate Y and scale XYZ for both these objects selected. So when I hit key, what I'm saying is I'm literally setting a keyframe saying, hey, when group 1 translate Y is set to 0, group 1 ball, the name of this, the sphere, right? Its scale XYZ are set to 1. The numbers don't have to match. I hit key and you can see in the attribute editor, these already went blue. Remember that anytime we see colors in the attributes to the right or left of these rather, it just means something is driving and controlling that particular attribute. In this case, it's when this circle, translate y equals 0. This group of all, scale x, y, and z equals 1. I'm going to take that control now. I'm going to push it up. I'm not going to move my timeline. We're not touching our timeline at all. I push my control all the way to the top. And up over here on the left, my group 1, control 1, right? Translate y selected. If I hit key now, nothing happens because I've not changed the value of my driven, which is the ball scale x, y, z. So I'm going to go over here to my scale, and let's just adjust that to something like 2 for now. That works. And all I have to do, I'm not setting a keyframe. I'm keying a set driven key, which means I do not hit S on my keyboard, but I set key within this window. And so now I've set a keyframe, not based on time, but based on the translate value of this particular control. So whenever I adjust this up and down, it incrementally adjusts my my sphere's scale. So if I put it like halfway and I look at that, like we're 1.5, which is almost halfway. That's 1.563, right? Which is almost halfway between 1 and 2, which is what I set my min and max values here. Before we move on and like test some of these other ones out, I want to pull up the graph editor real quick. So I'm going to go to Windows, Animation Editor, Graph Editor. And you can see with this sphere selected, I do have keyframes here. And if I scrub forward and back, nothing happens. Because remember, none of this is happening on the timeline. This is simply happening on the translate values. So if I just, yeah, there we go. There you go. You can see it right there. So if you set these and nothing's happening, or if it only happens when we get all the way to the end, it's likely that your graph editor curve is set to stepped, or if we're getting odd ease ins and ease outs, like we're set just the automatic spline. Like you see here, as I move it here, it's barely moving. Then we move up, it's moving a lot, and it eases into that scale at the top. Typically for set driven keys, I just like to select them almost always to linear. Like as you build these and customize these to how you would like it, you can eventually change this up to be whatever you would like. But for this particular instance today, that's all I need. I just like to mention that. Let's build scale up now for this object, for our helix here, spring, which means I need to load new driven keys in. If we have a project like this where I'm loading multiple things in and out, I need to make sure to just make sure that I have loaded into my driver and driven exactly what I want to control, because I could accidentally, load this driver in but still have my old ball driven in, right? So what I want to do is, I was actually looking for a way to reset these to default, but we'll just load in a new driver. So I'll select the control, load driver, and I'll select the driven, which is the spring load driven. Before I start manipulating this one, I do want to adjust the pivot point, because I do want the spring to go up and down, not from the center. So I'm going to hit D and snap that to the bottom, just like we've done before. Cool. And now I can connect translate Y. And I don't want to do scale X, Y, Z, because if I do that here, right, like we're just scaling this up and down. I specifically only want to select scale Y. So again, when this control is at 0, scale Y is at 1 key. I now move the control so it's max, and I want to make sure to actually move all the way to the max, because you didn't see there accidentally, when I push it all the way to the top, I accidentally pulled my mouse down a little bit, so it came out like 4.9. I just type in my translate Y, it's max, which is 5. Then I go to my scale, and I don't have to set that to 5. Sure, I can if I want to, but like I don't have to. I do that just like 2 if I wanted to, because it doesn't have to be the same number. We're just saying, hey, when this value or attribute is at that number, this one is at another number, and I can say key. So now we have our spring loaded in. We are rolling forward. Moving on to the next one. It gets a little bit more complex here, because instead of scale up, we have red, green. Let's load our driver, which is the control, and let's load our driven, which is the sphere. I have nothing over here in my second column for translate XYZ, rotate XYZ, or scale XYZ. I have all of that, but I have nothing here to dictate the material that we want to manipulate. The great thing about set-driven keys is that we can manipulate pretty much any attribute within Maya. And there are particular ways that we can load that in. I'm going to right click and hold over that sphere, and I'm going to say assign new material. I'm going to give it a Lambert. You can give it another material if you so choose, but Lambert if you want to follow along, right? I'm going to go over to my Lambert tab. Let's give it a name, right? Red, green, MAT for material. And in this attribute editor, with this object selected, I've navigated to the material. Right there's the color. It's like, all right, cool. How do I get that in my driven over here? Very easy. Right click your driven, or your color rather, and say set driven key. Quite literally that simple. And make sure you're loading in color. If you were to select some one of these other ones, guess what? There's our driven. There's our red green material that we just named. I renamed it from Lambert 2. There's my color RGB. There's my translates, incandescence, whatever you want, right? Right now, we're just focused on color. Note that when we do this technique of set driven key, based off of right-clicking the attribute in the attribute editor and going that route to open this window, it unloads our driver. Just got to reload that back in. Load driver. Same thing. I'm going to say translate Y, and instead of just doing R or G or B, I'm going to do all three, right? Because it's a mixture of colors that makes this. So I'm going to say, all right, cool. When this is at 0, right, for translate Y, my color, and like, right, I've deselected, so now I need to navigate back to this. I can just click it in the driven. It'll select it for me. I can then highlight these and then go back to my attribute editor to set this. I want to make sure this is red key. I'll now take that control, push it all the way up, translate Y, beautiful RGB. Let's get back into addressing that. I can just navigate now to this material. I've still got it pulled open over here in my attribute editor. Color green key. And now we have this shift in hue values taking us from red to green across the yellow, right? Like so. We've accomplished connecting a translate value of an attribute to RGB values of a material. I could do this with transparency, color. I can do this with a ton of things in Maya. This is what makes digital animation very strong, like features like this. You can hopefully start to see in your head how powerful stuff like this can really, you can connect different things together. All right, so we have sine wave, which is our last one. So I want to select this last column, and I will go to deform non-linear, and we'll add in a sine wave. If you're one of my students, you're familiar with this from your previous like breakfast scene projects. But if not, these deformers are very powerful. As soon as I click it, it makes the sine one handle, and I can adjust the amplitude to really introduce that, give it like a pretty large, or small, I should say, small wavelength. That way it's like a lot less distance between the peaks. And particularly what I want to adjust and animate with this control is this offset. So I'm going to set that offset back to 0 and get set up for loading my set-driven keys. I'm going to select my control, and in my driver, I'm going to load the driver again, which is this control. And for the driven, I'm going to load not the object, but very specifically the sine one handle. But notice as I do, and I actually had a student the other day didn't run into this, but I've selected that sine one handle. I've loaded it as the driven. We only get translates, X, Y, Z's, rotates. I don't have any of these options to adjust. I think if we select the object and say load driven, I had a student who bypassed this the other day. So it worked for him, but at the same time, if it doesn't work for you, it's the same thing that we just discussed with the color. I go over to my attribute editor. I right click one of these and say set driven key. There we go. There's my offset amplitude wavelength. And I can load my driver back in. So translate Y, I'm going to say is good. I actually will adjust this sine wave a little bit because I want that offset kind of to match up. Well, it's a big adjustment on that. That's all right. Nothing too crazy. Oh, there we go. So I just want that to match up, like the peak of this to match up. Creatively, you don't have to do that. You can do whatever you want. I will say key. I'll take this now all the way up. I'll go back to my wavelength. Oh, I'm sorry, my offset, not my wavelength. And move that peak up with it to match. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just showcasing that we can connect objects together. Oh, then I was adjusting. I tell you, look, that's where I made a mistake. Is I wasn't setting keyframes on offset. I'm setting them on wavelength. So how do we fix this? I've got these now on wavelength, and it's not actually doing anything because I messed up. If you've set keyframes on here, we can get rid of any connection that I have. I can right click the word wavelength over here and say break connections. That's going to get rid of the connections that it has, and I'm still able to adjust it. I had to reselect it, but I accidentally collect wavelength instead of offset. So let's go back now and continue to adjust this. I'll set my offset down. There we go. Key. Take my translate value up. Offset value up as well. And so now whenever I move this, my offset should be moving with it, and it is. So again, we can connect a lot of different things, right? Where, like, this is a very, very, very powerful tool within Maya. And any digital animation software. And it's kind of a staple across the board where we have some feature like this that allows us to manipulate one object and copy that kind of like change in attribute across to another. Now, what I would like to mention real quick is that this doesn't export out super well to other software. So if I was to do an FBX export, I would need to do a lot more extra steps to get this to export out. So I don't know that I would use this type of feature for a character for a game. Let's say that, unless I was building like the driven were built on joints. We'll talk about why that is a bit later. Just recognize that if I'm changing materials or if I'm changing like a deformer within Maya, that's pretty contained specifically to Maya. And for whatever I'm rigging, I'm really wanting to rig and render within Maya rather than export out to another software, because other software will not recognize and understand what these set-driven keys are. I just like to include that information in there because we are ever so hurtling towards a world where a lot of things are just done in Unreal Engine 5. And if I was to take an FBX export these out right now, I would have to bake them down for the scales, but then the materials wouldn't be adjusting the way that they are, and the nonlinear deformer would not come out at all. So I just like to make people aware of that as we work on these. And you'll experience that across the board, that, like there may be features within Unreal that we can't export back into Maya if we choose to do that process, or same from Blender to Maya, Blender to Unreal, Blender to Cinema 4D, whatever, what have you. These processes are very particular, and this is one that's pretty married to just staying within the Maya pipeline entirely. That being said, it's still really functional, and even if we did build a character rig specifically built for Unreal, we could still use this. We would just need to make sure that things are being translated to joints that could be baked down. We'll talk about what that means later on. I just like to throw that out there and include that in this portion. So set-driven keys in a nutshell. We'll pull up and be a little bit more advanced with this as we move forward. We'll talk a little bit about blend shapes as well. But yeah, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Reach out with any questions.